So when we look at the carbon cycle has to do with how carbon moves through the environment. If you could imagine tracing a single atom of carbon from one location to another location to another location. And it turns out that the carbon cycle and the way that people are interfering with it is related to global warming. And if we think about the two metabolic pathways, the big pathways that we've just discussed, in aerobic cell respiration, our reactants are glucose and oxygen, and our products are carbon dioxide and water. So we have a reactant with carbon in it, we have a product with carbon in it. In photosynthesis, CO2 is a reactant and glucose is a product. So again, we have a reactant and a product that both have carbon in them. So if we look at how these are connected, so let's think about starting with photosynthesis, because really photosynthesis has to happen first before aerobic cell respiration. So we have two reactants, carbon dioxide and water. And we also have to have an input of solar energy, or now that people are around, some types of artificial lights will work. And in the chloroplast, we go through photosynthesis. That's those light-dependent reactions and light-independent reactions that we've been talking about. And we make two products, glucose and oxygen. Now, glucose and oxygen are products of photosynthesis, but they're the reactants for aerobic cell respiration. And if we take these reactants and we go through glycolysis and then the oxidation of pyruvate and then the Krebs cycle, we end up making carbon dioxide and water. So the products for aerobic cell respiration are the reactants for photosynthesis. The products for photosynthesis are the reactants for aerobic cell respiration. So notice aerobic cell respiration and photosynthesis make up a big cycle. And remember what we've said about a cycle: wherever you start chemically, that's where you end up. But also remember, when we talked about metabolic cycles, we said what's important about them is not the chemicals going around in a circle, it's what is the input. In this case, the input is solar energy, and what's the output? ATP. So you could think of this whole output as a big, complicated process designed to change solar energy into chemical energy, the energy in chemical bonds. So let's look at how this is related to what we call the carbon cycle. And the carbon cycle is an example of something we call the biogeochemical cycle. There's also a nitrogen cycle and a phosphorus cycle and a sulfur cycle. And in Biology 106, when we talk about environmental science, we discuss some of those as well. But for now, let's think about biogeochemical cycles. So when we look at a biogeochemical cycle, first of all, notice it's a cycle. So things are going to end up back where they started. And what we're going to do is trace the pathway of some chemical, in this case, carbon, since we're looking at the carbon cycle, through bio, living things, and through geo, the non-living part of the environment. So a biogeochemical cycle traces some element, in this case carbon, through the living part of the environment and the non-living part of the environment. So when we think of the carbon cycle, we think of carbon as starting in the air. Carbon dioxide is a relatively common gas. Now, despite the fact that it's a relatively common gas, it's less than 1/10 of 1% of the air around us. About 78% of the air that we breathe is actually nitrogen gas, N2. About 21% of the air is oxygen gas, O2. Carbon dioxide is about 0.04% of the gas. So that's basically 4 parts out of every 10,000, 4 molecules out of every 10,000, or 1 molecule out of every 2,500. So carbon dioxide is found in the air, Now, wherever the air comes in contact with water, whether we're talking about, where Lake Michigan meets the air, or where the Atlantic Ocean meets the air, or where a small stream meets the air, some of the carbon dioxide that's in the air will diffuse into the water. And by the same token, remember, diffusion is a random movement of particles in all different directions. By the same token, some of the carbon dioxide that's dissolved in the water will diffuse out of the water. And remember, when we have diffusion, this movement is going to continue until we establish what's called a dynamic equilibrium, where things are in balance, essentially. Well, if we think about the carbon dioxide that stays in the air or the carbon dioxide that dissolves in the water, there's one major process in nature that removes this carbon dioxide, either from the air or from the water, if we're in an aquatic environment, and that is photosynthesis. Remember, in photosynthesis, as we just saw, carbon dioxide is one of the reactants. So this means that plants take carbon dioxide out of the air, or if they're plants that live in Lake Michigan or another aquatic environment, they take it out of the water. There are also some photosynthetic bacteria that do photosynthesis. So they take carbon dioxide out of the air or water that they live in. And there are also some algae that carry out photosynthesis. So any type of organism that we called an autotroph, remember we said autotrophs, autotroph means they can make their own nutrients. And all autotrophs that we're going to focus on do this through photosynthesis. There's a few weird bacteria that do some other techniques. So we're going to take some of the carbon dioxide out of the air and we're going to put it into plants. Now, what do plants do with this carbon dioxide? They do two things with it. They build their bodies with it. If you look at a tree, the trunk of the tree, the wood, the leaves, all the branches, when the tree makes seeds, those are all made from glucose that came from photosynthesis. So the plant builds its body from the glucose that it makes in photosynthesis. Where did the carbon atoms in glucose come from? Carbon dioxide. Now, some of the glucose gets used for a different purpose though. If we go back up here again, remember that glucose can be a reactant for aerobic cell respiration. So when our photosynthesizers need energy, when they need ATP, they carry out aerobic cell respiration. And notice that in aerobic cell respiration, if we follow the arrow, carbon dioxide is one of the products. So carbon dioxide is something that plants take out of the air or water, depending where they live, and so do other photosynthesizers. And then once they take that carbon dioxide out, they use the carbon atoms to build their organic molecules, and they also burn some of the carbon as a fuel in aerobic cell respiration. So when plants carry out aerobic cell respiration, we can see an arrow here going back up into the atmosphere. They return some of that carbon dioxide to the air, but not all of it. The plant's bodies contain some of the carbon atoms that the plants made in photosynthesis or fixed in photosynthesis. So what can happen to this? Well, one thing that can happen to the plant's bodies is they can be eaten by heterotrophs, by animals. And if we look at an animal, I think these are cows, it's hard to tell, but if we look at cows, all the organic molecules in a cow's body came from organic molecules in plants. And once the cows eat plants, just like the plants did, they use the plant material they eat for two different purposes. They build their body with it. The DNA, the proteins, the carbohydrates, the lipids are all made from what cows get from plants when they eat the plants. And they also burn some of the glucose that they get from plants in aerobic cell respiration. So they return more carbon dioxide to the atmosphere. And finally, at some point, these plants and animals die. And when they die, they're decomposed by bacteria, by fungi, by a few types of animals, by protistans. And when they go through decomposition, these organisms, fungi, bacteria, carry out aerobic cell respiration. So they return some more carbon dioxide to the air. Now, what we want to keep in mind is all the processes we've talked about so far are very quick. Diffusion between the water and the air is very rapid. Aerobic cell respiration and photosynthesis, animals eating plants, decomposers breaking down living materials, those are all very rapid processes. They happen in a matter of minutes. Now, if a cow dies, we might not break down its entire body in minutes, but individual reactions start to occur very quickly. However, when organisms die, their entire bodies aren't decomposed. Some organisms die in environments like swamps, and the water in swamps doesn't have very much oxygen in it. And since it doesn't have a lot of oxygen, a lot of the bacteria and fungi, the things that break down living organisms when they die, a lot of the decomposers, really don't work very efficiently without oxygen. So when living organisms die in a swamp, they decompose very, very, very slowly. Or when living organisms die in the ocean, sometimes their bodies drift down to depths where there's no oxygen. Well, some organisms end up in environments at the bottom of swamps or the bottom of the ocean where they don't decompose. Before they can decompose, their body is covered with dirt and mud. And then the bacteria and the fungi, the decomposers, can't reach them to decompose them. And as they get covered with more and more mud and more minerals, over a time period of millions of years, as they get covered more heavily, the pressure on them increases. And eventually that pressure can compress the organic materials that were in a living thing's body, and they can form coal and oil, which we usually call petroleum when it's still in the ground, and natural gas. And coal and oil and natural gas are all things that are called fossil fuels. Now they're called fossil fuels. You know, fossil implies that they come from organisms that are dead. And they're mostly carbon and hydrogen. And carbon to carbon bonds and carbon to hydrogen bonds have a lot of energy in them. So when we look at coal and oil and gas, there's a lot of energy in the chemical bonds. So this is what makes them good fuels. That's why they're used as fossil fuels. Now, if people didn't interfere with this cycle, let's ignore this factory for just a moment. If people didn't interfere, it takes millions of years to make these fossil fuels, and it also takes millions of years to burn them. Because for them to burn, once we have a deposit of coal or oil or gas, we have to have something called erosion occur. The land has to wear away over this deposit of coal, oil, gas, and they get exposed to the air. And when they get exposed to the air has oxygen in it. So lightning strikes can cause these deposits to catch on fire. But here's the thing. It takes millions of years to make these fossil fuels. It takes millions of years for this weathering and erosion to release them back into the air. So diffusion is fast, the biological processes are fast, but making fossil fuels and then weathering and erosion to release those fossil fuels are incredibly slow, millions of years. So let's see how people are interfering with the carbon cycle, and that's where this factory comes in. What we do is we dig up fossil fuels and we use them as the fuels to power our factory, to heat our homes, to run our cars. And there's nothing necessarily wrong with that. The problem is we're taking a process that would take nature millions of years to take the carbon in these fossil fuels and put them back into the air. We're doing the same process by burning fossil fuels in a decade or two. So this means we're adding carbon dioxide to the air much faster than it's being removed to make fossil fuels. So since we're burning more fossil fuels than they're being created, the carbon dioxide levels in the air are going up. Now we're also doing something else that has a pretty big impact on carbon dioxide levels in the air. We're cutting down forests. If you look at satellite images of the Earth from space, you can see the Amazon rainforest in South America getting a little bit smaller every year. In Africa, you can see the Sahara Desert expanding a little bit farther south every year and crowding out what used to be tropical rainforest. So when people cut down trees, remember carbon dioxide is a reactant for photosynthesis. So when people cut down trees, we're taking less carbon dioxide out of the air. So we're taking less carbon dioxide out of the air because we're cutting down trees, and we're adding more carbon dioxide into the air because of the fact that we're burning fossil fuels. So, combine those two and what happens? Carbon dioxide levels in the air are going up. So carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere have gone up measurably in just about the last 50 years, which is when we have our most accurate records for carbon dioxide levels. Now, why do we care if carbon dioxide levels in the air go up? Well, because when we look at carbon dioxide in the air, it's a little bit different than nitrogen or oxygen, the two main gases. So let's think about what happens when sunlight hits the Earth. So when sunlight hits the Earth, solar radiation that gets to the Earth from the sun has a short wavelength. Remember, we talked about electromagnetic radiation the other day, and we said it had two properties, wavelength and frequency. So as the sunlight is coming to the Earth, some of the solar energy is absorbed by the atmosphere. Some of it's absorbed by the surface of the Earth when it hits the Earth. That's why, if you go outside and you walk on blacktop in the middle of summer, the blacktop is hot. Now, some of the sunlight that hits the Earth is reflected back into space. Remember, light that's absorbed, whether it's absorbed by the atmosphere or the surface of the Earth, the land and the water, absorbed solar energy can't be seen. Reflected light can be seen. So this is why we can see images of the Earth that are taken from the space station. But when solar radiation is reflected, the wavelength changes, and the radiation changes from having a short wavelength to a long wavelength. And as this long wavelength radiation leaves the Earth, as it's reflected back, even more of that is absorbed. Turns out the gases in the air can absorb the long wave radiation more efficiently than they absorb the short wave radiation. So if we look in the air, what we see is, remember what I said, nitrogen makes up about 78% of the air. Nitrogen doesn't absorb very much sunlight. Oxygen makes up about 21% of the air. Oxygen doesn't absorb very much solar energy. But there are three gases that are relatively common. Now keep in mind, when I say they're relatively common, they're still combined less than 1% of all the gases in the air. One is carbon dioxide, which is the most common of these three. And the other two are methane and nitrous oxide, which are a little bit rarer. They absorb much more solar energy than oxygen and nitrogen do. Because of this, they're called greenhouse gases. A greenhouse uses panes of light, panes of glass or panes of plastic to accomplish the same thing, to trap light and warm up the air in the greenhouse. So in this case, when we increase the amount of carbon dioxide, Oh, and by the way, people are also increasing the amount of methane in the air, and we're also increasing the amount of nitrous oxide in the air. As we increase the amounts of all those, we absorb more solar energy. So they're showing these arrows that refer to the absorption of solar energy as being thicker, and these arrows escaping out into space as being smaller. So the math is basically pretty simple. The more carbon dioxide we put in the air, the more solar energy gets absorbed. The more solar energy we get absorbing, then the warmer temperatures get. Now, current climate models, and here are really kind of 4 different climate models. Current climate models suggest that, you know, as we go forward, they're extended out to the year 2100. Remember when we talked about hypothesis testing, we said another way that scientists try to gain knowledge is through making models. These are examples of computer models, not physical models. If carbon dioxide emissions stay at about the same level into the future, in other words, if we're burning about the same amount of fossil fuels that we are now, this is what will happen. Global temperature will continue to go up, and will go up about 0.4 of 1 degree Celsius. Now keep in mind, that's pretty close to 1 degree Fahrenheit. And then we have 3 different projections depending on if carbon dioxide emissions grow, if we burn more fossil fuels, and if we burn them just a little bit more than we are now, a lot more than we are now, or a medium amount, kind of the Goldilocks idea, you know. And the more fossil fuels we burn, the more carbon dioxide will end up in the atmosphere. Now, you may have heard about the Paris Climate Treaty, and the goal of the Paris Climate Treaty is to limit global warming to 2 degrees or less. So we have to look here, and basically that means low growth, if at all. And really the Paris Climate Treaty is taking, notice around 1900, carbon dioxide levels weren't up at 0 yet. They were down here. So the Paris Climate Treaty is actually taking this into account. So it doesn't go all the way up to 2, it goes to about 1.5. So one of the problems that we see right now is we're pretty sure that if the global temperature warms more than 2 degrees, it's going to be fairly catastrophic. But right now, in just 2020, basically, we're on the verge of the temperature already having gone up 2 degrees. So we're pretty close to that mark right now. We haven't quite got there, but we're pretty close. And scientists have already started seeing some things. There have been some studies done showing that plants and animals are migrating towards the North Pole in the Northern Hemisphere and the South Pole in the Southern Hemisphere. Why would they do this? Well, the climate is a little bit cooler as you go further north in the Northern Hemisphere or south in the Southern Hemisphere. So if temperatures are warming, organisms can try to find a cooler environment. Now notice, animals usually have a little bit easier time moving than plants. Plants have to kind of rely on their seeds drifting on the wind, or maybe their seeds getting stuck in an animal's fur and getting carried to a colder climate. There's also very strong evidence that a lot of plants and animals that live on mountainsides are actually moving up the mountainsides. If you've ever been near mountains, you might know that, on the top of mountains, if they're tall enough, there can be snow year round. So the climate gets gradually colder as you go up a mountain. So one of the things we see is that animals and plants are moving closer to the poles and further up mountains. Now notice there is a potential problem. If you think about animals that are moving up, say, a mountain to escape warmer weather, At some point, you run out of mountain to move up. When you get to the top of the mountain, if it continues to get warmer, you're in trouble. So this is a potential issue. Now, if global warming was happening very slowly, like it's happened in the past through natural processes, the advantage is sometimes organisms can evolve and adapt to different temperatures. But right now, humans are changing the temperature of the globe much faster than it's happened in the past through natural processes. So that's part of the problem. Now, warmer temperatures also are going to cause some economic instability because there are going to be changes in which regions of the world or the country that you happen to be looking at are suitable for agriculture. There are a number of studies about agriculture in the United States, for instance, showing that if the temperature gets up to about 2.5 or 2.75 degrees Celsius increase over the average temperature in the past, places like Illinois and Iowa and Nebraska and California are probably not going to be ideal places for agriculture. The agricultural belt is going to shift and be more in Wisconsin and Minnesota and Michigan and maybe areas like Montana or Idaho, and even southern Canada. So if you think about this from a global economic and political perspective, if you have a country like the United States that throughout its history has relied heavily on agricultural exports to support the economy, and all of a sudden our agriculture isn't so hot, that could change things fairly drastically. Probably the most noticeable problem that has been focused on, that you've certainly seen something in the news about, is as global temperatures go up, the ice that's in the glaciers on the land and at the North Pole, particularly on Greenland, and at the South Pole and Antarctica are melting. Now, if we're looking at water, if we're looking at ice that's already over the water, when it melts, it doesn't really raise sea level. It's water that's on land that raises sea level when it melts. So we're talking about glaciers. And there are glaciers, for instance, in the Rocky Mountains out west in the United States. There are a lot of glaciers in the Himalayan mountains in Asia. But the biggest glaciers are on Antarctica and Greenland. And these two, some people consider Greenland to be a continent, some people don't. Antarctica is definitely a continent. But these two land masses have enough ice on them that if it melts, Antarctica has enough ice to raise sea levels about 73 meters, which is about 220 feet. Greenland has enough ice to raise sea about 6 meters, which is about 20 feet. Now, keep in mind, when we say that this is how much sea levels would go up, this is the increase in the height of the sea. But it's estimated, for instance, if sea levels went up 66 meters, the sea would actually go in about 60 meters from where it currently is. Because if you think about beaches, if you've ever been on a beach, even on Lake Michigan, most beaches are very gently sloping. So for every meter that the water goes up in height, the water tends to go about 10 meters further in. So if this would happen, this would be disastrous worldwide, because throughout human history, where have most of our large cities been built? Near rivers or on oceans where there were natural harbors to facilitate trade. But a lot of these places would have difficulty. You know, when you were a little kid, you might have seen that kind of story about Holland with the little boy with his finger in the dike. But Holland actually does have dikes built to hold back seawater because the country of Holland is actually below sea level. Well, if sea level continues to increase, you know, we don't call it Holland anymore, we call it the Netherlands, but the Netherlands is going to have a difficult time surviving. Some major cities like London are already very close to sea level. So raises in sea level that are this high could be devastating. So how do these raises in sea level occur? So let's look at some land, this black blob down here at the bottom, and let's look at the ice shelf. The ice shelf is the part of the ice that's supported by the water. The glacier is the part of the ice that's either on top of the ice shelf or further in. It might just be directly on top of the land. So what happens with global warming? Well, the air up here is getting warmer. The water that's in contact with this ice in the ice shelf gets warmer. Now, this ice shelf normally provides some friction. So it stops this glacier from dropping its ice into the water. But when the air gets warmer and the water gets warmer, this ice shelf tends to break up. Now, some of these pieces are pretty big. There have been several parts of the ice shelf in Antarctica that have broken apart that are as big as the island of Manhattan. But when these parts break off, what's more important in terms of the sea level is that now we don't have this ice shelf extending out and stopping the glacier from advancing. So the glacier tends to advance, and as it advances, it just pushes ice off into the oceans. And remember what I said, this is the ice that raises sea levels. So at this point, sea levels haven't gone up extremely far, but we're not sure if people will be able to control what happens. Because if we go back to our graph, one of the problems is if we look at the countries that produce the most carbon dioxide and therefore contribute the most to global warming, they're industrialized countries like the United States, countries where people don't use a lot of fossil fuels, don't contribute as much to global warming. But part of the problem is, if you go around the world, why do a lot of people come to the United States? Because they want to live the lifestyle that Americans live. So the problem is a lot of parts of the world are trying to emulate the United States. And if they're successful, the difficulty is then it will be very hard to only have a low growth of carbon dioxide output. Because if everybody is successful in living like Americans do, unfortunately, we're probably going to be in the high growth scenario. Now, keep in mind, these are models, so none of these are absolute predictions. None of them are correct. It's very similar to something that we'll see in the next few months, since hurricane season has started early. When hurricanes near shore, there are always models about where they're going to hit. And these models look at things like the temperature of the water, the temperature of the air pressure, the amount of water in the air, and they make predictions. Some of them make more accurate predictions than others. But these similarly are complicated computer equations that show what could happen given certain scenarios. Unfortunately, until we actually see what happens, we won't know which model is most accurate. Are there any questions about the carbon cycle and global warming? Okay, if there are no questions, I'm going to stop sharing this for a moment and